is Elizabeth Robertson and I am the Coordinator Languages and Culture with the New South Wales Department of Education. Please be aware that today's session is being recorded. Thank you so much for joining us today, whether you're here at the live session or watching the recording. If you haven't already, please type into the chat your name and your school. And if there's a group of you, please add everyone's name and school. This is really important data which helps us keep track of who's attending these sessions. As we commence our session today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and extend my respects to any Aboriginal people who may be joining us today. I am delivering from the lands of the Wallamedigal people in Ryde, and this photo is taken from a lookout near my home, which provides an amazing view over this beautiful part of New South Wales. Because this is our first meeting for 2021, I'd like to introduce or to reintroduce you to our team, and I'll just give you a moment to take a look. Our curriculum team, who are shown in blue, provides support to language teachers 7 to 12 in implementing New South Wales language syllabuses through professional learning, advice and resources. And our Tanken Centre team, in red, delivers the Nihongo Tanken Centre's Japanese immersion program. The biggest addition to our support in the last 12 months has been the launch of our statewide staff room in Microsoft Teams, and that's a screenshot of it there. Languages was the very first KLA to have a statewide virtual staff room, which we initially launched in Yammer. We have 631 teachers interacting in Yammer, so we didn't want to lose that incredible resource. By creating a new statewide staff room in Teams and adding Yammer as a tab, we're able to create the best of both worlds. In the coming weeks, we will be running a short session, so it won't be an official statewide staff meeting. It will just be an information session on how to set up Teams, how to use Teams, and how to set up your notifications. As we know, many of you are new to this technology and may not be getting the best out of it just yet. I'd now like to hand over to our guest speaker, Marina Lang from NESA. Marina is the Principal Project Officer, Diversity, and is also joined by Christy Kirkham, NESA Project Officer, Special Education, and Regina Berghofer, Senior Curriculum Officer, Languages. So Marina will lead today's session, and it's wonderful that we have additional NESA colleagues here for support. So I'll stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to Marina, who will start sharing hers. So just bear with us while we make that swap.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Just thought I'd say a quick hi to everyone as we're swapping over presentations. It's really wonderful to be invited to speak to you today. You are the language experts of New South Wales, and I will not presume to know what all of the knowledge and skills that you have. However, I'm pleased to be able to talk to you about students with disability, and hopefully we can start a conversation about some of the more effective ways to support those students as they take languages in your schools or take your languages subjects. So hopefully there'll be some useful information for you here today, and we'll certainly have some time for some chat towards the end of the session. So I'm just going to start presenting. Okay, so Elizabeth, can you just confirm that my presentation is showing okay there?
We can see the beautiful purple, pinks and green.
I know, isn't it wonderful, our NESA colours. So if you've got some, I'm going to just basically run through the presentation till the end here. And so if you've got questions that come up for you as I'm talking, then please feel free to pop it into the chat, and at the end we'll try to come back and address those questions, or maybe just jot it down for yourself and then you can put the question in the chat at the end of the presentation. I think it's really important to start by thinking about what are some effective strategies that is going to work for everybody. As teachers, we work really, really hard to make sure that we're catering for a whole range of students in our classroom, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to do something different for every individual student, because that's just an impossible task. So I like to start by reminding people that if we can think about teaching and learning and assessment from a perspective of inclusive design, then we will actually be able to cater for a larger number of students in our class than if we worried about individual needs of every student. So this is an excellent cartoon that I think captures the message really, really well. What we want to do is put our efforts into shoveling the ramp, and that way everybody can get into our teaching, learning and assessment, rather than worrying about having to shovel the stairs and shovel the ramp, which is just twice as much work for the same outcome at the end. Some people like to do this by using the Universal Design for Learning framework, which talks about making sure that in your teaching and learning and assessment that you've got multiple ways to represent your information, allow for students to express themselves in multiple ways, and have multiple ways to engage students in their learning. Some people, though, are more comfortable with the differentiation pedagogy that's been around for a while and born from Carol Ann Tomlinson. And that looks at thinking about differentiating the process, the product or the content of our teaching, learning and assessment. Either way, it doesn't really matter, because all of these frameworks that talk about these ideas of inclusive design really come down to the same three principles. And that's thinking about presenting information in a range of ways throughout our teaching, learning and assessment, making sure that students have got a range of opportunities to express their knowledge, so that we're not just assessing them using the same methods or modes all the time, and making sure that we're using different things to stimulate learning and engagement. So they're really the three core principles of inclusive design. Whether you want to use a framework such as Universal Design, or you want to think of it from a differentiation perspective, you're really thinking about those three core ideas. And so what it comes down to is flexibility, accessibility, choice, flexible communication, and acknowledging students' diversity. And I'll just give you a moment to have a look at the information there on the slide in relation to those principles of inclusive design. So if we're trying to incorporate some of these principles into our teaching, learning and assessment, then we're doing the right thing in terms of trying to meet the needs of as broad a range of students as possible within our classroom. I'm not going to spend too much more time talking about inclusive design, because I do want to focus now specifically on students with disability. But if you did want a little bit more information, we do have some information on our website that might help you. So we do have a web page on differentiated programming in our kindergarten to year 10 section of our website. And we also have some information on differentiated assessment that you might want to come and have a look at. There's a load of information on the web, though, about UDL and differentiation, so that might be something that you want to go and explore further if you're not familiar with that pedagogy. So we know that inclusive design is really effective in trying to meet the needs of a broad range of students, but there are some things that we can do differently to specifically cater for the needs of students with disability. So even though we've maybe embedded principles of inclusive design into our teaching, learning and assessment, there may still be some students with disability who will need some specific adjustments in teaching, learning and assessment, and there may be some students with disability who may need access to life skills, outcomes and content. So I'm going to start now by talking specifically about adjustments, and we'll run through some examples and how you make decisions about the right types of adjustments to make. And then I will end the talk today by covering off on some key points about delivering life skills, outcomes and content. So the first thing that I think it's really important to remember is that adjustments are about providing equity, and they're not about giving an advantage. And that's a really hard concept, I think, for a lot of people to get their head around. And I appreciate that as teachers, you know, we're often having to explain that to, you know, the student community, the parent community, and a whole range of other players in this field. But I think it's really important that we ourselves start from that very firm belief that what we're doing when we're providing an adjustment is bringing a student with disability up to the starting line of a running race. We're not advancing them in that running race. We're not giving them a time advantage or anything like that in that running race. We're bringing them up to the starting line, because the fact that we're making the adjustment really comes from the principle that the student's disability puts them behind the starting line. And so what we're doing is bringing them up to the starting line. A lot of questions that we get are focused around stage 6, and we do still have some teachers who ask whether or not we can make adjustments to assessment in stage 6. People seem a little bit more nervous about that, because there are obviously some specific assessment requirements that NESA sets and the HSC exams to be thinking of. But I want to really reassure you that there is certainly many places, but this is one place where this statement is made on our website, that you are able to and should be making adjustments to teaching, learning and assessment from kindergarten all the way through to year 12. And finally, I think the other really important thing to remember is that when we do make an adjustment for a student with disability, that should not restrict the student's access to the full range of grades or marks. So I have heard in the past a few teachers talking to me about some practices at their school where the school community is willing to make adjustments for a student with disability, but there's a very clear statement that says, however, if an adjustment is put into place, the student cannot receive a grade higher than a C or a mark higher than whatever that might be. So just making it really clear that that is not really equitable practice, and that's not something that you should be doing, because the adjustment isn't advancing the student in the task. It isn't making the student perform better than what they're entitled to perform or what their knowledge, understanding and skills would place them at. And so therefore we don't need to cap their grade or their mark. We need to continue to assess whatever their response is on its merits and give the appropriate grade or mark based on the student's response. So what is it that we are meant to be adjusting then, and how do we go about doing that? It's really important that we know we're not making adjustments to the curriculum. So the outcomes and content of your syllabus remain as they are, and there is no need to be modifying or changing those in any way. What we are doing is we're providing better access to that syllabus, those syllabus outcomes and content, and providing a more equitable way for students to demonstrate their achievement of those syllabus outcomes. So remember that in our language syllabuses, the objectives and outcomes are generally formulated around these key ideas of interacting, producing texts, understanding and responding, and cultural understanding. So our syllabus objectives and outcomes are not specifically about speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Those are the contexts through which we might teach and assess those objectives and outcomes, but that's not actually what the syllabus outcomes is focused on. So students who are unable to access the context of speaking, listening, reading and writing may need adjustments to help them to access those contexts, or in extreme cases, if their disability means that they can in no way undertake speaking, listening, reading or writing equitably, then you may need to assess them through a different context. And we will talk about that in a little bit more detail as we move along, because I appreciate for some of you, you might be thinking, oh, how does this work? Especially if NESA is requiring you to assess through the context of speaking, listening, reading and writing. So hold on, more will come, and hopefully something effective will be, you'll get something effective out of what we're talking about. So here's just a basic list or range or examples of adjustments that you could be making, because people will ask me all the time. I have a student with a hearing impairment, I have a student with autism, I have a student with dyslexia. What adjustments could we be making for those students? And really, there are the list is endless. So here are some examples that you'll find on our website. And if you weren't sure already, last year we updated that web page on our website, and so now we have a range of new examples that you can have a look at in those categories here if you're interested, to get some ideas of what you could do for your particular students. We also do have some specific advice we are just about to publish to support students with disability learning a language in kindergarten to year 10, because we know that there's a requirement for all students to take languages in stage 4. So that web page specifically about supporting students with disability in languages should be published on our website really, really soon. I was hoping it would be ready for today, but unfortunately we haven't been able to do that. And I will certainly let you know through Elizabeth and your team at the Department of Education, so that you can go and have a look at that when it is ready. That will basically cover off on a lot of the information that we're talking about here today. So there are a range of adjustments that you can make, remembering that the adjustments are all about access and demonstration of achievement, and they're not about modifying or changing the syllabus outcomes or content. So the next question would be, do we have to provide an adjustment for every student with disability? So if you are informed at the commencement of the school year that in your class you have 5 students who have a range of needs, and these are their needs, do you have to make adjustments for all of those students? So the answer lies in number 1. Is the student impacted by a disability? So you've been told that yes, they are. And number 2 then, what is the functional impact of that on the student's ability to participate in your lessons and in assessment tasks? And if the answer is that they are impacted by their disability in particular teaching and learning situations or in particular assessment contexts, then reasonable adjustments should be provided. So it's not a case of student has disability equals I make an adjustment. We really have to be doing that middle bit, which is what is the functional impact of that disability on the student in a particular teaching and learning context or in a particular assessment context. And then if we find that the student is being impacted, then we would need to minimise that impact by putting in an adjustment. One of the questions that we often get asked too is about how we record those adjustments. So we're quite comfortable in knowing who the students are in our class, whether or not they need an adjustment. We've got some ideas about what adjustments to make. So how do we record that in our teaching and learning documentation? So NESA doesn't necessarily regulate what you put in your teaching and learning documentation, but we do say, this is from our website, that you should be making decisions about how the following elements are shared in your teaching and learning documentation. So these are all the things we should be seeing, but how you document that is really up to you. We do have a couple of examples on our website of how adjustments can be recorded in teaching and learning programs. So you're welcome to use one of these approaches, remembering that this is not a must do. You can use another approach if you want to. So some people build it into the teaching, learning and assessment part of their teaching and learning programs. Some people have it as a separate column or flag it in a different way. Some people record it at the end of a teaching and learning program. There is a requirement to have evidence that you're making the adjustments, but how you record it in your programs is really a decision that you would make either as a faculty at your school or as a whole school. So we're going to have a think now about assessment tasks specifically, because this is where I think people would like to get a little bit more advice on how best to support students with disability, given that there are some really unique strategies that are used in language courses to assess the syllabus outcomes. So remembering that we can make adjustments to assessment tasks all the way from kindergarten to year 12. And that when we make an adjustment, we think about those same three ideas. What is it that we need to adjust? Is it the content of the task, so the language used to describe it, maybe choices of topics or text or context to respond? Should we adjust the way the student accesses the task? Whether that might be extra time, it might be rest breaks, it might be scaffolding, it might be chunking or checkpointing to provide students with opportunities to respond appropriately. Or do we need to make an adjustment to the way in which the student responds? And this is the bit that we're going to focus on a little bit more in the rest of the presentation. So just like our principles of inclusive design or differentiation, we can think about adjustments in the same way, thinking about those three key elements. Do we need to adjust the content, the process, or the product? Once we've decided that, and obviously the answer to that question is based on what the functional impact is for a student with disability. Once we decide that, then we can start to think about what the adjustment might need to be. And really, as I've said before, you can adjust anything that will minimise the barrier that the student is experiencing. But you have to still assess the outcomes that were selected for that task, and you need to assess those outcomes to the same standard. So if we think about minimising the barrier, let's talk through a couple of examples here. So you might have a student who is affected in particular ways in a speaking context or a hearing context, etc., a listening context, but perhaps does not experience that same barrier if the task had a different context. So we'll dive into that in a little bit more detail, but it's all about minimising that barrier, but keeping the outcomes the same. So thinking about assessing the outcomes and keeping those intended outcomes. If, for example, we wanted to provide the student with extra time or scaffolding, that's in no way going to interfere with the outcomes that we intended to assess. But if we change the question of a task so that we're asking students to listen to or read a conversation and then describe the issue being discussed instead of justifying one of the speaker's opinion, then we might not be assessing the same outcomes. So we have to be really careful that whatever adjustment we make is going to enable the outcomes that we need to assess to actually be assessed. So we remember that we start by selecting the outcomes that we want to assess, and remember that the outcomes do not specifically require speaking, listening, reading, or writing. They're about broader ideas to do with interacting and understanding and responding, etc. The outcomes are your priority. And then if we are teaching if we are assessing in K to 10, we select the context through which we assess those outcomes. We decide if we're going to assess them through a speaking, listening, reading, or writing context. And if we're assessing in stage 6, we would follow the advice from Nessa about the components and weightings. And then we make adjustments to remove the barriers to accessing the task through that chosen context. And if the student's disability is so significant that they still cannot access the context of that task, speaking, listening, reading, or writing, then we may need to provide that same assessment or assess the same outcomes through an alternative context. Because the goal is to assess the outcome through those contexts or skills of speaking, listening, reading, and writing, rather than to assess those actual skills themselves. So in year 7 to 10, let's be really clear, Nessa does not set any particular requirements to assess through the context of speaking, listening, reading, and writing. We certainly acknowledge that those macro skills are absolutely essential to the learning of a language, and we hope that in teaching, learning, and assessment in 7 to 10 or K to 10, that teachers are using a range of those macro skills and developing students' skills in all of those areas where it's appropriate. But there aren't any hard and fast assessment rules about needing to assess speaking, listening, reading, and writing. So you certainly have flexibility in K to 10 to make the right adjustment for a student with disability, or if necessary, change the context of a task for a student with disability in K to 10, given that there is no requirement to assess specifically through those skills. Now in stage 6, we do actually have requirements that say you need to assess, you need to include in your assessment program a certain amount of weighting towards speaking, towards listening, towards reading, and towards writing. So of course we would expect to see those contexts being set and those skills being included in your assessment program. And a large part of that is to prepare students as well for the HSC exams, which do include speaking and listening. So in stage 6, we do need to think about it perhaps a little more carefully. We can still make adjustments to enable the student to better access the task in speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And I would say in extreme circumstances where the student absolutely cannot access those, the tasks or the skills in those tasks, then we could change the context. Knowing, however, that in the HSC exams, there is a slightly different situation happening. So I think one of the things that's really important is that through the subject selection process, we're actively speaking to students about the assessment requirements and the HSC exam requirements for students in each of the subjects, so that students understand that by taking the course in the HSC exams, they are going to be required to undertake a speaking exam and a listening exam. Now we do, in HSC exams, we do provide a whole range of adjustments and disability provisions for students in those speaking and listening exams. We haven't had a case yet where we have had a student who absolutely could not access those contexts of speaking and listening. So we haven't really come across a situation yet where we've had to consider anything alternative to that. In all cases that we've had, we've been able to provide the right adjustments or provisions for students to be able to access speaking and listening. And so I would encourage you to be thinking about that, but knowing that you can, in your school-based assessment, you can do an alternative task if that is going to be the best option for those students. And then you'd need to be speaking to our disability provisions team really early about the particular needs of the student that you're teaching to prepare them for needing to perhaps assess the types of provisions that would be provided for them. Remembering, of course, that the ultimate goal is to assess the syllabus outcomes. So if we have a look at, take Stage 6 French beginners as an example, and we look at the fact that, yes, there is a requirement to assess 30% listening, 30% reading, etc., etc. But in that 30% listening, if we actually look at the outcomes that are being assessed from the French beginners syllabus, you can see that the outcomes that would be assessed in a listening context are not necessarily about the skill of listening. So remember that it's those outcomes that we want to assess, and we are it's recommended for us that we assess that through a context of listening. So the adjustments that we make are really not about interfering with those outcomes, even if it means that we are in some way adjusting that context of listening, whether that's through pausing, whether that's through seating or positioning, or an oral interpreter, or sometimes even playing the audio multiple times for a student with a particular disability. None of those adjustments really interfere with those outcomes. We can still assess those outcomes even if we make those adjustments. And the same if we look at something like writing. These are the outcomes that are being assessed, and so the adjustments to the context of writing will still allow us to be able to assess those particular outcomes. And that's the same for speaking. I'll let you have a quick look at those outcomes there. So remembering that adjustments are not just about the HSC exams, and that the HSC Disability Provisions Program is specifically for the HSC exams, but that adjustments should be happening for our students with disability all the way through kindergarten to year 12, and that you as teachers and schools have authority to make the decisions about the best adjustments for your students in your school-based assessment tasks, including school-based exams, right up to the HSC exams. Now, I completely appreciate that probably what you want to do is provide the same, in year 11 and 12, provide the same adjustments for your school-based assessment tasks that the student is likely to receive in their HSC exams. And I completely understand that at times there may be a tension between what it is you're doing at school or want to do at school and what can and would be approved in the Disability Provisions Program. All I can say to you is it's really important for you to have confidence that you can make decisions without NESA's approval, and that if you are thinking constantly about the functional impact of the student's disability on that speaking context or listening context or reading context or writing context, and then making the adjustment that minimises that impact, you are doing the right thing, even if the adjustments that you make at school are not replicated in the HSC exams. We understand it's a difficult process to navigate because we don't process those applications until the student is in year 12. But again, just wanting to stress with you that you can have the confidence to make the adjustments that you feel are reasonable for school-based assessment, and just remembering that it's about really constantly thinking about the functional impact of that student's disability and how we can remove that impact so that the student has the same or equal chance at showing us what they know and understand than a student who doesn't have or is not impacted by that disability. Some of the adjustments that you could make in speaking, listening, reading and writing contexts are here. I've just popped them up on the screen for you. And most of those adjustments are adjustments or provisions that could be considered for the HSC exam. Things like a transcript for a listening exam is not something that we would provide for the HSC exams, because obviously then it does remove the fact that it's a listening exam. And playing the extract multiple times can be approved through HSC disability provisions, although it's really for exceptional cases where there is enough evidence to show that the student's hearing is impacted in an extreme enough way, I suppose, to warrant that particular adjustment. And the only other thing that we would typically not do for the HSC exam is provide scaffolds for extended written responses and things like that. But again, that's not to say that these are things that you can't do in your school-based assessments. Remembering that we just need to keep communicating with our students and our families that as a school, you are responsible for school-based assessment, and NESA is responsible for provisions in HSC exams. So I guess the main takeaways I think I want you to have from this part of the presentation is that, remember, we're assessing the outcomes. The outcomes are not necessarily about the skills of speaking, reading, listening, and writing, that we use those skills through which to assess the outcomes. And so you really can make adjustments to a speaking context or a listening context so that the student has equitable access to that task. And in extreme cases, if you really, really need to, because the student cannot in any way access an assessment task in that context, you can assess the same outcomes using a different context, provided you are assessing to the same standard as well. And then it's over to NESA to consider what would happen in the HSC exams in those contexts. Something that you might find useful to help you make those decisions is our webpage on principles for examination modifications. Now, these are the principles that NESA uses to guide our decisions about adjustments for the HSC exams, and could provide you with some good parameters as well to think about what adjustments you could make in your school-based assessment, particularly in Year 11 and 12. And then on top of that, we've got a range of case studies on our website. Now, none of them are language centred. However, they are still good illustrations of how we have made adjustments to teaching and learning programs and assessment tasks to suit or to meet the needs of particular students with disability in Year 11 and 12. So you might want to go over to our website and have a look at that as well. So I'm sure there's probably a lot of questions, and we will have some time to come back and address those questions. But I want to just focus a little bit on life skills now, and then we'll be able to take some questions. So we have developed life skills outcomes and content from Year 7 to Year 12 that really enables students with a particular disability to participate in and progress through the curriculum. The advice that we give is that the life skills outcomes and content are particularly for students with an intellectual disability. So whilst you don't necessarily have to have a formalised diagnosis for a student, you would need to have some evidence that the student is cognitively or intellectually functioning below their peers. And this would be something that the learning support or special education teachers at your school would be working hand in hand with you to determine whether life skills outcomes and content are appropriate for a student or not. And remembering that it's not an appropriate option for someone who is simply performing behind in your language or struggling with your language course, and who could be helped with the right adjustments and support. It's really for students with an intellectual impairment, and generally a significant one, so that they can access our curriculum. The decision for a student to access life skills outcomes and content should be made collaboratively with parents, carers, teachers, student, other people. Generally, and again, this is up to each individual school, but it's my experience that there is a person in the school who would be responsible for the student's individual education plan, and that's usually the learning support teacher or special education teacher. And as part of that individual planning, those individual planning meetings, that person, that teacher, would be making decisions or talking to all the right people about whether or not the student should be accessing life skills outcomes and content, other adjustments that might be appropriate for the student, or other curriculum options that would be appropriate. So it's not necessarily up to you as a language teacher to decide whether or not the student should be accessing life skills outcomes and content. You really need to have a conversation with your learning support and or special education teachers if you feel that you have a student who might benefit from that, and then collaboratively be making the call about whether or not this is an appropriate option. And then if you do have a student in your class who should be accessing or does need to access life skills outcomes and content, then your teaching and learning programs should reflect those life skills outcomes and content. So we need to have teaching and learning documentation to show that you are delivering those outcomes and content for that student. You would know that our kindergarten to year 10 language syllabuses include life skills outcomes and content. But in stage 6, we don't have any specific syllabuses for language life skills courses. However, schools can still deliver a life skills course for a language in stage 6 by applying to NESA, and that's through our school developed board endorsed course program. Now, there has been some changes to this program, and there is new criteria for what will be endorsed as an SDBEC in stage 6, and that's up on our website. There's no change to whether or not a life skills course can be endorsed for a language in stage 6. We can still accept those applications, but I would encourage you to have a look at the new information on our website that talks about new things that need to be demonstrated in the application. The application process is done through Schools Online, and you do not have to write your own objectives, outcomes and content. We already have a framework in the application form that gives you objectives, outcomes and content for a language life skills course in stage 6. You just need to show what topics you would be delivering and how you will be putting together the content objectives and outcomes towards those topics. Now, there have been some conversations recently about the time frame for these applications. Typically, we have asked for the applications to be submitted the year before a course is going to be delivered. I understand as a language teacher, you might not know until you start delivering your year 11 course that you have a student in your class who needs to or should be accessing your language course as a life skills course. So I do want to assure you that previously we have accepted late applications. We are changing the process slightly, so I can't guarantee what is actually going to happen for this year. There should be some more information coming up on our website soon, but I can assure you that there will always be ways in which you can submit an application to us for to meet the needs of your students. Can I encourage you, though, that you do need to be taking this back to your school and perhaps talking to the learning support and or special education teachers at your school about perhaps a way that this could be communicated through your subject selection process, so that when the students are in year 10 and they're deciding on their subjects for year 11, I assume whoever is in charge of that student's individual education plan would be working with the student to decide on the most appropriate courses for them. And really at that point, if the student has been at your school for a significant amount of time, somebody should know that the student should be accessing life skills outcomes and content. And so that then needs to be communicated early so that you can start the planning for how you would deliver that course, given that for language in stage 6, it has to be through application to NESA. So perhaps if the practice at your school has been that that's all been a little unknown until you've been landed with your class, you need to have some conversations at your school about tightening up that process a little bit and that communication, so that there is an opportunity to, at least by subject selection time, know that this is something that needs to be put into place for a student. And then I guess just keeping an eye on the NESA information about what the process is and whether there are any hard and fast cutoffs for those applications. So I'll just leave you with this final message that I think sums up what we're trying to say here. And that is that, remember, we don't have to make everybody climb a tree in order to assess the outcomes of the syllabus. We want to try to focus on what the intentions of the syllabus outcomes are and the syllabus content, and make sure we provide accessible opportunities and equitable opportunities for our students with disability to demonstrate that they have learnt something through the outcomes and content of our syllabus. I know Elizabeth is going to share some contact details of mine later, so I don't need to keep that up too long. I have a feeling there have been a lot of things coming up in the chat, so I think we might have some time for some questions now. I think I've stopped sharing my screen. Now, for some reason, my chat screen has gone completely blank. Oh, Elizabeth, you want to come in and do something before we throw to questions? Yep.
Yes, hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
Thumbs up. Beautiful. Thank you. So thank you so much, Marina. We will pop back and have question time with Marina in a moment. But just before we open up the floor, I just wanted to remind you that last year, just in time for term 4, we released our Let's Party unit of work. It is a generic unit of work that you can adapt to your language. This unit was developed to support you in differentiating and adjusting teaching, learning and assessment activities to support a range of students, and includes information on both differentiation and adjustments. If we zoom in on the teaching and learning activities for a moment, in the suggested teaching and learning strategies column, we have included sample differentiated learning activities. In this instance, it's looking at a range of activities for consolidating frequency when talking about food and drink. And then in the sample adjustments column, we have included sample ways to adjust activities for students with disability. Now, obviously, as Marina has said, these would need to be developed to meet the needs of the individual student or students in your class who require adjustments. As a generic unit, we can only provide you with ideas. So, for example, in this column, on your program for your 8E class, you may consider writing the student's name and the actual adjustment or adjustments that you made to meet their needs in order for them to be able to demonstrate their learning at that point. And as Marina also said, these adjustments should be developed through a collaborative curriculum planning process with the student's parents or carers, the learning and support team, and whoever else is involved in the last team at your school. So I'd now like to open up the floor for questions. What I might do, Marina, if it helps you, is just have a look at some of the key questions from the chat. I have been doing my best to answer some of them, but not all of them. Yeah. And I'm also not the expert.
Sure.
So I think if we can just make sure that we've answered as much as we can. So in answer to the question, what evidence do we need to determine that the student has a disability? That's a discussion to have with the learning and support team at the school. if you feel that there is a disability that has gone unrecognised during the student's earlier years of schooling, then you need to bring in the learning and support team and work with them to see if there is a disability, any sort of disability.
Yeah.
But jump in, Marina, if I have no idea.
No, that's absolutely right. Just talk to the people in special ed at your school learning support team or special ed team, and then if there is evidence of an intellectual impairment, then you can go down the route of considering life skills. But that's not for you alone as a language teacher to consider. It should be, a sort of a team conversation, and the person who is in charge of the student's IEP really needs to be leading those discussions, I think.
Absolutely. And this is a question, it sort of initially came from Amanda, but then you answered it. So now I have a question. So Amanda was saying, could you provide the transcript for listening? And you actually answered that question just by coincidence to say no, because that turns it into reading, if we're talking stage 6 only. But one of the examples you put up for making adjustments at stage 6 for listening was to have oral or sign interpreters. Are you able to just explain a bit more about that?
Oh, I wish you hadn't asked me that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't mean to put you on the spot. You can.
No.
What we can do is share the information later, if that's.
Yeah, I'll come back with more information on that, because I haven't seen that happen in an exam myself. Like in my teaching experience, that wasn't something I had a direct experience of. So I will come back with more information about that. But I do just want to say, Amanda's question about if and I think there was it sort of came up further in the chat about hypothetically if we have a student with a hearing problem. So it really comes down to what is the level of hearing loss and vision loss, whichever one you're talking about, and language or speech delay or speech loss, and how does that impact. So you can make the adjustment to the speaking or listening context as far as possible until you hit a point where even that adjustment is not going to work. So if I take it to the extreme, if you had a completely deaf student in your class, there's no adjustment you can make to a listening task that's going to help them access the listening task. So therefore it can't be a listening task anymore. But if you have a student that does have a level of hearing, but there is a hearing loss, it's dependent on that level of loss in order for you to decide what's the best adjustment for them, because that is what's going to answer that question for you. And it's the same for speaking. If you have a student who is completely 100% mute, or if I take it to the extreme, has got no facility to speak whatsoever, then you need to remove that speaking context altogether. But if you have a student who can speak, then and perhaps the speech is delayed or the speaking is hard to understand or whatever it might be, then it's about what adjustments can you make to make that more accessible. So it's always about adjustments first until you hit a point where that context absolutely becomes just not valid anymore, or not equitable. So it's not good enough that the student might be able to access it this much, but still is impacted by their hearing or speaking loss or impairment. It has to be sort of you have to be able to provide that access to an equitable level, because everybody else can do it. So I don't know if I've explained myself very well.
Look, I think so. And I think the key message is that the adjustments need to be made on each individual student. And so, we all talk hypotheticals. Our sample unit on the Let's Party is kind of all hypothetical. But what's important is when you have a student with disability who's in your classroom and you do need to make adjustments, you then know exactly what that disability is, and then you can work with NESA to tailor advice and support to that student. Yeah. And that's really the only way to do it is as you come across them. A question here about large print dictionaries.
Yeah.
Wouldn't there be? I'm not an expert. But wouldn't there be some sort of like it's not a magnifying glass, it's like a magnifying square that sits over the top of text? I've seen that. And so it basically turns every text into large print. So I would suggest that. And certainly you can use, students can use digital dictionaries for school-based stage 6 assessment, that's a reasonable adjustment that you can make at your school level. That's fine. It's just that NESA can't promise that that will be replicated in the HSC. So I understand what the question's about. You want to train them for using a dictionary, and I would suggest, you know, that going down that path of this. I've seen it. It's like a big thing that fits over a book. In terms of mutism, I know one of the options is that students record instead of speak, but once again, as Marina said, if they do not speak at all, then you'd have to change the context.
In any circumstance. I mean, yeah, there's a whole lot of adjustments that you can make to reduce if the mutism is related to anxiety or that kind of thing, then yeah, you can change. You can support the student through that and still have them speak if they're able to. But you know, coming back to your previous point too about the large print dictionary, etc. This is something that you need to work with your learning support teachers and special education teachers with. They're there to be able to help you provide advice or seek out advice from the right organisations, whether that's Vision Australia or other places that you can go to try to source the right resources for your students.
Oh, and so lots of suggestions in the chat as well.
Oh, great.
And just from Fwong, if a student who's at the special ed unit is learning a language, do they need to have an individual program? Students should have an individual education program in that situation. And that's a situation where, you know, it's most likely they would follow a life skills language course. But as Marina said, I think because we've had 3 queries in the last week about life skills in stage 6, and I think what's concerning us most is that life skills languages courses are being offered when there is no life skills course at the school, because the school has to develop that course. And so there needs to be a lead-in time. And so that's a conversation that you as the language teaching experts need to have with your learning and support team, because it is quite different offering a life skills course in languages compared to a life skills course in maths where it's all ready to go. So just that's something to be aware of. We can't go into every individual school and fix that problem, unfortunately. And as Marina said, NESA has been a little kinder with timelines for languages, but they also need to have a reasonable lead-in time to check the rigour of the school developed course. So, you know, it is a tricky place.
And one of the things that I used to do, I mean, look, it's been probably 15 years since I was at a school, but I will go back that far and reflect on my experience. One of the things I did when I was there in teaching in a big mainstream high school, I used to put the life skills courses on the lines, on our subject selection lines. And then it was clear from the get-go that there were students who, and obviously students didn't self-select. That was something that, you know, there was a condition that you select that subject in consultation with the learning support team. And once we had that already then on our lines. It became like a subject, even though the students were often integrated into mainstream classrooms to deliver those courses. But we knew right from the get-go, these students were going to take English life skills or Japanese life skills or maths life skills, and here it is on the line, so we can actually slot them into the class. And then it worked with the school reporting system and all of that as well, because it was created as a class from the beginning. So that might be something your school might be willing to consider, so just something to talk about. But definitely the learning support and special ed teachers who coordinate that student's individual plan are the key players here in having that communication. I just wanted to come back really quickly, I know the clock's running down, to Katia had a follow-up question about selective mutism and how you modify the content. So I think it's just really important there, Katia, to remember that the content, you really are it's really all about teaching the outcomes. So even though, like, I'm thinking about the K to 10 language syllabuses, and I know that there's a specific block of content around speaking and pronunciation and intonation, etc. Now, if you have a student who is not going to speak at all, then it becomes recognizing, it becomes about them being able to recognize intonation patterns, etc. And not so much about the pronunciation, because the outcome itself isn't necessarily tied to their ability to speak. And even if it is, you know, we can't, it's a bit like the deaf student situation. We can't, if we did have an outcome that assessed listening and we had a student who absolutely could not do that, well, we're not going to penalise the student because they are unable to meet that outcome. We would work around the outcome to provide relevant learning experiences for them that still focus on you know, speaking a language, but doesn't make the student have to do the speaking, if that makes sense.
Our time is very sadly up. I would like to offer a very heartfelt thanks to Marina for presenting today. Marina came and presented to the Languages and Culture team about 15 months ago, and we all left that session feeling about 20 kilograms lighter, because it is such a complex space for language teachers to navigate. And we are so incredibly blessed to have someone in NESA who is so aware of our syllabus needs and who's so open to talking to teachers. So Marina's email address is back up there. Marina, are you able to share today's presentation? It's okay if you can't.
Yes, I'll send you a copy after this meeting and you can forward it on. Sure. And I just want to say thank you, and thank you to all the teachers here for, you know, taking the time to think about students with disability. That's amazing in itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. We want to make sure that all students are included in our lessons. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you very much to Marina and also her NESA colleagues, Christy and Regina, who have been hovering in the background and I know have been part of the preparation for today. And we have our next statewide staff meeting coming up in week 7. We hold 2 per term, and the week 7 meeting is going to look at assessment schedules. So hopefully we'll see lots of you there. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us.
Take care.